Welcome back. Episode 4 of the Seven County Witch Hunt Project podcast. We turn our attention in this episode not just to the accused, but to the families surrounding those people and perhaps the impact that is felt on those families by an accusation of witchcraft. But also we take in the concept of familiars as well, and not necessarily the stereotypical concept of witches' familiars being toads and cats and dogs and all of the things we see pictured and labelled Vinegar Tom and all of those in Hopkins' famous woodcut. But familiars from within the family. Before we start, a content warning for this one, that this does naturally mean that we are going to discuss family trauma and the loss of family members, and in particular the loss of children within a family. If that topic is difficult for you to listen to and address, do please feel free to skip ahead now to the 5th episode, where we'll be covering other topics completely. So with that in mind, welcome back, Tabitha and Marion, to our coffee shop, our base for this entire series, because it involves coffee. We've started a lot of these episodes by looking at stereotypes, and perhaps looking to break down those stereotypes a little bit. So we've looked at the stereotyping of gender, for example, and we've broken that down a bit. And we've looked at the stereotypical things that people were accused of and unpicked that a little bit. But I want to start this episode by looking at the image of the witch and the stereotypical image of the witch of this period more generally. So the way that these people are perhaps described in literature of the time, and how that's influenced the way that we see them now. The typical crone, the cackling hag, all of these kinds of ideas, the childless spinster woman of witchcraft. Break that stereotype down for us.
So often, at the time of the witch hunts and ever since, people think of the witch as an older woman, particularly a very old woman, who probably is isolated from the community, lives by herself. If she has had children in the past, they've gone, they've left her. She is alone in the world. Maybe she's a widow, maybe she's a lifelong spinster. Either way, she's somebody who people at the time would have described in really among them, the most horrible ways they could think of. So things like hag, beldam, which means, on one level, beautiful woman, beldam, but on the other hand is used ironically to mean somebody who is the exact opposite of being a beautiful woman. Somebody who is wrinkled, somebody who is tattered by life, somebody who maybe has certain kinds of facial features, like a gobber tooth, as they would describe it. So, a sort of gap-toothed or a toothy old woman, a woman who's angry with her life, who's likely to curse and swear and be envious of other people, particularly perhaps people with children. She feels angry with the world because she is poor and nobody looks after her. She goes around gathering a few old sticks to warm her, to put on her fire. She goes from door to door begging. She's this abject figure outside of the community, and that is because she is an older woman. And that's really the stereotype that people from Reginald Scott in the 1580s onwards saw as the figure of the witch. And even though Scott was presenting that figure in quite a sympathetic way and saying, actually, this person is not a witch, or is not to be presumed to be a witch, you should be sceptical about deciding whether this person is a witch. Nevertheless, he and others succeed in entrenching that as the stereotype of the witch that we now receive today.
Does other literature, art, woodcut representation of the period feed into our modern views still?
Yes, it does. So when you look at woodcuts of accused witches, they are so often of older women. So you've got one from 1619, a case from the Leicestershire-Lincolnshire border, where a family of women, Joan Flower and her two daughters, Margaret and Philippa, are accused. And they are deliberately presented as these kind of slightly odd-looking people. They are disabled, so they're on sticks and crutches. They're people whose faces seem to be odd shapes, even by the standards of woodcuts. You know, this isn't the highest level of representation where you would expect absolute accuracy. But nevertheless, they have prominent chins and noses. They have that sort of classic witch face that people might expect. They look angry. They look threatening. They are frowning. They are kind of coming towards the viewer with their animal familiars in a cloud behind them, so that you know to be afraid of these people. The stereotype is very much in evidence in visual representations at the time and ever since. And I think that's one of the really pervasive pictures that people have in their mind of the witch.
You mentioned the Flower family. That trial and others are significant because they talk about the parental influence over children within witchcraft. So this is the parents teaching the children, inducting the children into witchcraft. Is that actually a thing at all? Talk a little bit around that subject and how relevant that actually is.
Very relevant, I think. And it was something that I was very curious about and wanted to explore a little bit more because, you know, the Flower family is a really good example of some very sensationalist literature. You know, it's a very famous case from the time, and it involves this kind of, you know, this mother and daughter's trio. And a lot is made in that pamphlet about how, you know, the mother has sort of taught her children. I think it even says at one point, you know, these children are diligently learning their lessons, sort of were inducted into sort of the ways of Satan. And so that kind of the idea of the family being sort of subverted and destroyed basically by sort of being corrupted in this way is a really important sort of motif of the kind of the witch idea in this period. And I was wondering whether that was just a story basically sort of written to scare people. But it turns out that actually the idea of inheriting witch knowledge, or at least a generational taint existing, is really, really powerful in this sort of 1640s witch hunt. Again, I've been counting up the number of cases from Huntingdonshire and Cambridgeshire where a person is accused, and one of the pieces of evidence laid against them is that their mother or their father was a witch beforehand. And they wouldn't necessarily have been formally accused of witchcraft, although some of them definitely were. But the idea that somebody's parents being a witch would be enough for you to have knowledge of how to be a witch, or potentially just being corrupted yourself, maybe because of the blood that you carry, or because of the sort of the upbringing that you had, is a really important factor in people carrying that sort of identity for the rest of their lives, even if they try to eschew it. It's not true of all of the children, which I think is really interesting. Sometimes you have one person who is accused of witchcraft, and, you know, one of the pieces of evidence is, oh yeah, his mother or her mother was a witch. But they'll have siblings who don't get accused of witchcraft. So how that works is really interesting as well. But yeah, in short, yes, there definitely is a connection.
It seems to hold true across the whole range of counties as well. So if you look at Essex, if you look at the origin of the witch hunt, the first person to be questioned, well, among the first people to be questioned, there are two women who are seen to be the daughters of witches, and that's Rebecca West and Bess Clark. And that seems to be a really powerful motivator for picking on Bess. Everybody knows her mother was a witch. Some of her other kinsfolk, we're told, we're not sure whom were executed for witchcraft. So that's just quite a wide grouping of family from whom she's supposed to have inherited this trait. And then you get Rebecca West, who accuses her mother, Anne West, and other people accuse Anne as well. And there's a long drawing out from Rebecca of the way in which her mother supposedly inducted her into this witch cult. You know, she took her along to Bess Clark's house. They looked at books there which were anti-Christian books, and she was essentially converted into a kind of witch religion by her mother as part of her upbringing. So that holds true in Suffolk as well. You know, you've got whole families accused there. So it seems to be quite a pervasive part of the stereotype that is actually true.
So the family could play one of two roles when we look at witchcraft accusations. The family could be responsible for condemning somebody to trial in the first place, or the family could rally round and protect the accused from things going further. Is one of those more prevalent than the other across the research that you've done, would you say?
Yes, from my point of view anyway, the familial taint version of that is much more prevalent, maybe because of the nature of the sources. You're much more likely to be reading confessions where people implicate each other than you are to be reading defences of a person who's been accused already. And it does seem very, 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 very broad, actually. It seems like even when you don't know what somebody's family was accused of in the past, it seems quite likely there are a whole range of cases where we don't see the evidence, but you can imagine that their mother, their aunt, etc. were accused of witchcraft before them. So most of what I've seen has been precisely that sense that your family condemns you, your family taints you. You can't escape from that family identity.
And is it the case for those that you have looked at then that perhaps people are being accused because of a family history, or are people accusing a number of family members in one go? Like this entire family is tarred with the witchcraft brush?
Yes, a bit of both, I think. I think with the sense you get with the Essex cases anyway that I've just talked about is that people have thought for many years, in some cases decades, that family is the witch family. And, they're not surprised at all when the daughter of that family also turns out to be a witch. It's like a kind of foregone conclusion that that's what's going to happen.
There is also quite a few instances of family members accusing each other, right? So a couple of examples from Cambridgeshire involve a stepchild, for example, accusing their mother of being a witch. And I think there's two aspects to that. There's partly the fact that, they are more intimately bound up with the rest of the family, so they can observe unusual behaviour. But another aspect is potentially the resentment that comes from the sort of fractured household, as most families in the early modern period would have been. I think statistically it was more likely that you would lose a parent before your sort of 15th birthday than you have two surviving. So the idea that you would have a stepfather or a stepmother was a really important sort of aspect of growing up in this period. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be conflict just because it was common. And so I think that sort of that extra aspect of this is really important, that it's not just that some people were carrying a taint because their original mother, sort of their birth mother was a witch, but also kind of suspecting that this person who's married into your family could also be a witch is really important.
It is.
And that's a very strong motif when we think about folk tales and fairy tales, for example, the evil stepmother, the evil queen who is the siblings and so on. That's a very strong motif. And do you think that there's some kind of relevance there, that it is just a broad idea that fits into any theme like that?
Yeah, I think that the folktale aspect of it is really important, and I've been getting more and more interested in it, really, because the other classic folk tale is the magic animal that comes to you and talks to you and offers you something fantastic. You get 3 wishes, or you get beanstalk, or whatever. And I think those tales are really important in shaping people's evidence. And the wicked stepmother is absolute, that's this classic Snow White evil queen wicked witch mashup is really, really important. And I think it's just been sat there in people's heads for centuries. And it comes out when somebody's asked to tell a magistrate or a clergyman a story about their family. I think that's one of the first things that's going to spill out.
I think especially with kind of the way that folk tales used to be, like obviously since Grimm's fairy tales, we've had sort of quite a standardised version of folk stories, but the whole point of them is originally that, you would make it your own with each telling. So the fact that you've got these ideas of a witch that come through in people's testimonies, but they are hyper-specific and very much tied in with somebody's identity, that's kind of the point of a folk story, So the fact that it's kind of playing out in their lives probably confirms their own ideas, right?
And when we think about the importance of storytelling and oral tellings in those times and before, and we consider the role of travelling storytellers, like the droll tellers of Cornish history and those kinds of people, that means that these stories will inevitably always take on geographical changes as these people travel around, because you always take local aspects and you incorporate them into the base story that you're telling. This still goes on today. If you go and watch a local pantomime, you've got a traditional story, but it's always going to parody prominent members of the local community and those sorts of things. It's just what you do. And it was no different then. So a travelling storyteller would come to an area, they'd get a handle on what was going on locally if they didn't already know, and they'd incorporate that into those stories. So maybe things also become embedded in that way too.
Yes, I think so. And also you think about travelling peddlers and sellers of news pamphlets. You know, those are going to do the rounds in a community, and people are going to going to read it if they're literate. They're going to have it read to them if not, and they're going to think, oh, that's just like my family, or that's just like my life. So I think these story structures, I've always thought this, but it's kind of come back to this interest with looking at so many witchcraft stories. It just feels like that genre happens over and over and over again. It gets passed around because people like to hear the same stories and they like to tell the same stories again.
And especially by the 1640s, we're not looking at trials that are happening in the 1560s when these concepts are quite new. We're looking at a time period where they've had 100 years of these ideas coming into communities and being reshaped and having confirmation of their truth as well. You know, you've got sort of reports happening from a couple of villages over of these witch trials and sort of people actually being condemned of witchcraft, or even within the same community, and those ideas again spreading out again. So in so many ways, the concepts are very ripe and ready in people's minds by the time you get here.
So when we look at both accusations of witchcraft at this time and also the actual activity that is being talked about when we talk about these accusations of witchcraft, what are people actually doing to be accused in the first place? What's the role of trauma within the family as part of those accusations? So we're looking at this familial aspect of accusation, which is quite common. What role do these family difficulties and traumas play in those accusations?
I think a big role, because they predispose people towards the kind of conflict that Tabitha was talking about. And they also kind of preload the idea of stories of the supernatural quite often. You know, if a family member has died, then you've actually got a kind of ready-made ghost story that you might want to tell about that and about your experiences remembering that person or interacting with that person if you believe they continue on in spirit form, you know. And this seems to influence an awful lot of the stories. There are an awful lot of stories where you've got a familiar, an animal familiar, who is also clearly a human ghost in some ways. So, you know, you've got figures like Ellen Driver of Framlingham, who I think we mentioned in a previous episode. And she talks about, you know, she had these two familiars who she'd somehow managed to procreate and give birth to with the devil. And then they sort of frittered away somewhere. And it makes you think immediately, well, these are probably lost children. This is probably what she's talking about. And maybe she's thinking about them as kind of fairy changelings, or maybe she's thinking about them as sort of hybrid animal-human creatures, or there's something, you know, terrifying and miserable in her history, which has made her focus on these creatures. And when she's put under enormous pressure to tell a story, out they come in this folkloric form that we've talked about. And I think the more I think about the idea of the ghost familiar, and there's a really nice article by Victoria Carr about the ghost familiar, if people want to go and have a look at that. The more I think about that idea, the more I think it's really pervasive throughout the history of witchcraft stories. You get it as early as you get ghost familiars as early as, say, the 1570s. There's a really famous Scottish example where somebody meets a ghost who has died in battle and talks about them as a kind of familiar creature. And then, if it works its way all the way through to the 1640s, as Tabitha says, it's got this long history of when you're asked to confess something, one of the things you might consider confessing is, I have a ghost familiar.
I think also there is that question that people would have had in their minds about the sort of the doctrinal existence of ghosts. it was very clearly established in Catholicism that, ghosts exist, that they, are sort of potentially souls that were stuck in purgatory and come up and haunt the living, normally to give them warnings of some kind or urge them to repent. But by the time you get to the 1640s, then, there is a sort of counter argument that ghosts, don't exist because purgatory doesn't exist. And therefore, what you're seeing is probably the devil. And that comes through in some of the confessions. There's this kind of question of whether it's the devil that they're seeing or a ghost. So an example is Margaret Moore, who's haunts me as a historical figure. Because she confessed to having been visited by her 3 ghost children, who ask her for her soul in exchange for keeping her final surviving child, her 4th child, alive. And she makes that exchange. She says, yes, you absolutely have my soul. And then after that, she starts feeding the familiars that she's given her blood. And so she's combined these 2 concepts. She's combined the ghost and the demon into her own grief, but also into something that she can bargain with. So it's an absolutely heartbreaking story, but it's also evidence of this kind of shifting idea of how the supernatural works and what you can potentially do with it.
So what's actually happening in a case like that? This is grief within the family, or a mother's grief for lost children, manifesting itself in this story, but what aspects of this are actual event and what aspects are story?
So I personally think in this case it's an experience, not a story. I do think that she experienced this, partly because she confesses it several times and she goes into a lot of detail about it, and partly because I don't think it's an easy thing to make up. I don't think this is something that she was sort of being put on the spot about. I think it's something that she could talk about, or wanted to talk about even. And obviously grief does manifest in many different ways, and the desire to see your dead children, I completely sort of sympathise with what that must be like. And also, her younger child presumably was ailing in some way. And there's a suggestion that maybe it was malnutrition that was causing the child to suffer, or potentially it was just the disease that had taken away the previous ones. But that desire to save that child and the guilt that must come from potentially losing another one, combined, sort of probably makes this a very, very real experience for her. I'm going to stop with that.
But this is one of the areas that we can only ever speculate about, isn't it, in terms of this? We can read the accusations, we can read the trial documents, we can read all of these recordings about the narratives of the time. I hesitate to use the word story because it has connotations that aren't necessarily right, but certainly we look at these narratives, we can only speculate as to what's actually happening against what is recorded to be happening. But the strength of belief in the supernatural of the time certainly has a bearing on that, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it does. And when you see the same story over and over again, and you look at things like the parish registers that we talked about before, and you see the amount of child mortality, it seems very, very likely that what we're dealing with is real experiences. It would be really unusual for people not to have lost a child, a couple of children. And you see over and over again, families of 7, 8 children being born, and then a child's name being repeated. So, you have a John born in the 1570s and christened, and then you have a John in the 1590s who's christened, who's clearly replaced it to some extent, the previous John in their parents' imagination. They wanted to have a child with that name, and the first one died. And the more you look at that kind of serial grief, people must have lived with so much grief and fear that it's really hard for us to imagine now, at least if we live in a society where there is a considerable amount of support for children's health. It's really hard to imagine how difficult that must have been. And, the second you're put under some kind of appalling pressure and people are looking at you, and again, that idea of, they are imagining your guilt. And they're imagining you're guilty because you're a witch, but you're imagining you're guilty because these terrible things happened to you, and what's the more you could have done. it's so easy to imagine that that's a really, really common experience, and that therefore the stories that we read are stories at some level of real events as well as of imagined events.
Another factor I think we need to consider here is that the gendered aspect of this as well. When there are ghost familiars that turn up, sometimes or often they're associated with the mothers of the children that were lost, and the fathers don't really get mentioned. And I think that's really important. Margaret Moore, we know that she was still married when she was being visited by these ghost familiars and when she was accused of witchcraft. But she doesn't mention him as the father of these children. It could well be that these children were from a previous marriage. But it could also be that the father wasn't as involved as you might want him to be, and that dealing with that level of grief without your partner's support is another aspect of this, and the idea that it was mostly on the woman to be the caregiver and to sort of have healthy children in the first place. That extra pressure and that sort of being turned on potentially by the people closest to you, I think it should be factored into these cases as well.
That is a really interesting point.
Thank you.
There we go.
Can we just clarify what the role of these familiars is within the witchcraft narrative? And can you perhaps compare and contrast that to the role of animal familiars within a witchcraft narrative?
Such a lot of overlap, and the familiars, the thing about a magical familiar is that it can morph into a load of different shapes, and I've always thought that was interesting. So if you look at say Bess Clark's familiars, the famous Vinegar Tom, to start with he supposedly appears as a greyhound, and then later on he appears as a creature with a child's head. So you've literally got this sort of hybridization going on in the story. So what is it? A child? Is it a ghost? Is it a dog? What is it? And she calls these creatures, she's got 5 familiars, and she calls them my children. And you think, well, what am I supposed to do with this story? It's all one, isn't it, in the imagination that's being extracted from her under pressure. But I think you probably could say that there are 2 distinct types of familiars, even though they sometimes get very confused. And one of them is a straightforward animal familiar. A small dog came to me and it offered me, riches and power. And I said yes. And it said, can I have your soul? And I said yes. And then it drank some of my blood. There's a story there, which is a really distinct story about a human-animal interaction and the animal then drinking the blood of the person on whom it's preying, so kind of vampiric sort of creature, if you like, and giving your soul to an animal, which is all kinds of wrong in the early modern imagination. And then on the other hand, you've got the ghost familiar, who is often some kind of family member, often a child. And that feels like it's a distinct story, and they're more wistful, those stories. Yes, they do incorporate the same elements quite often. The gift of the soul, the pact with the devil. But then quite often they do go off in unexpected directions. So, there's this sense that the children, or the creatures, whatever they were, sort of withered away, or the person telling the story can't identify them, can't produce them. And that does feel like a narrative of loss and grief, which is different from the other one, maybe.
I think that it's also the fact that when they're ghost familiars, they're not as easy to control. So that idea of kind of wayward children, I think, sometimes comes through in these stories. And I think another aspect that maybe we should pay more attention to when we're looking at these kinds of records is the names of the familiars, right? So there's lots of familiars that do appear in the shape of animals, but sometimes they have human names, and sometimes they have very unusual names, potentially pet names, that kind of thing, like Sack and Sugar. Presumably you're not going to call a child that. But when the devil appears to you in the shape of the mole and you call it John, and you happen to have a child who's died called John, then maybe, even though it's a mole shape, it is still a ghost that's appearing to you. And I sometimes wonder about this with Grizzle Greedy Gut as an overlap kind of thing, because that's a very child-based pet name. Sort of like, oh, Greedy Guts. My grandmother used to call me that when I wanted more ice cream when I was a child. And I sort of wonder whether that's, is that an animal familiar or is that potentially a ghost? So are there more ghosts out there than we potentially
Oh, that's lovely. So pet names are actually nicknames for lost children.
Maybe.
That's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? Where do these cases fit in terms of the introduction of spectral evidence within the witch hunts? Are these within that period or before?
They're kind of before, in that most of the spectral evidence is late. People may be most familiar with it in cases like Salem in the 1690s. But it's not that far before. You get a really famous case in Bury St Edmunds in the 1660s where this shows up. So it feels like maybe this is part of the same area. And it's not unknown before this period either. But it feels like maybe this is something distinct from that phenomenon, but yet which is also related to it and might one day feed into it, I suppose.
So, especially because we do have reports from the Civil War of spectral beings appearing on battlefields and that kind of thing. So maybe by the 1660s we've got these two aspects of the story kind of combining.
I have wondered every now and again if the Civil War is really important in this. I mean, people are surrounded by this landscape of death. People are dying in large numbers in places not far from them. There are battles raging across the country. How much must it have felt like a haunted land? How much must they have thought about death and the prospect of their own potential death? Not because of all the usual reasons for mortality. Some terrible epidemic or an infection that just went crazy and killed them, but actually they might be shot. They might be caught in cannon fire. They might be stabbed by marauding soldiers. I wonder how far that influences the idea of a landscape of death. I wonder how far it influences these stories.
So do you think it's the case that there's been an escalation in the role of familiars, the appearance of familiars within these cases in the run-up to the 1660s through to the end of the century, that has led to the importance of spectrality, that has then led to the introduction of spectral evidence later?
That's really interesting. Again, I'm going to say don't know. Familiars have been hopping about in witchcraft narratives since the very earliest stories that we know in the 1560s. So the place is absolutely heaving with animal familiars. But whether they then go on a journey towards something more human and the idea of ghosts becomes more embedded in the idea of familiarity, if you like, literally the family ghost. I think that's really intriguing and something that people might want to look at.
There's a follow-on project for you right there, isn't there? There we go. Finally, just to wrap this particular theme up then, and I don't expect you to give me a number here necessarily, but how prevalent are familiars, whether those are ghost familiars related to children or animal familiars related to the broader witchcraft narrative within the cases that you've examined? How often do familiars crop up?
Almost always. They really are absolutely everywhere. And this is specifically English cases that we're talking about, because of the geographical focus of our project. So this won't be true of other witchcraft narratives from other places. But they seem almost compulsory. It feels like if you don't think that you have an animal familiar, you would have to invent one in order to confess. And the more you can magic up, the better. If you've got 5, brilliant. People like John Lowes and Bess Clark are among the most productive fantasists of familiars, because they say, I've got 5, I've got 7. And one person confesses actually that, she's got so many familiars that they can't all suckle on her at once. They actually fight over her body. She talks about piglets on a sow. She says they're fighting like piglets on a sow to get at the teat. So actually, familiars are more or less essential in this period if you want to tell a story of witchcraft.
This has been a more challenging topic perhaps to explore for some. In the next episode, we move on to a topic which is perhaps more unlikely for some, and a lot of people wouldn't link to the witchcraft narratives that we're discussing. And that's the role of the environment, not something that springs to mind immediately when we talk about witchcraft trials and accusations. That's in episode 5. In the meantime, to wrap up this episode, let's just remind people where they can find the project and yourselves online. Marion.
You can find us at the Seven County Witch Hunt on Blue Sky, and you can also find us across a variety of social media platforms, either under our own names, or Tabitha is Magic Not Witches, among other things, and I am Witches Etc. Or Witches Etc. Insta, so you can follow us on a whole range of platforms.
So in the meantime, while you're waiting to listen to the next episode, you can go and read also the Seven County Witch Hunt Project blog. How do people find that, Tabitha?
So medium.com/witches7hunt will take you there.
And there are links on the episode page for this episode and in the show notes to save you having to remember all of those things. You have 2 weeks until the next episode comes out in order to go and read all of the things that you haven't read yet and bother Marion and Tabitha online with your questions about what you've heard so far. We'll look forward to you all joining us again in our coffee shop next time.